We're now continuing in our series on tefillah. We had really just finished last week our introductory series on why we daven. And what I want to do now is the next few weeks really go through a trace of the development of tefillah. Meaning, aside from the question of why we daven, the other question that we need to deal with is there a biblical mitzvah to daven? If there is, what was the biblical mitzvah? What is the biblical mitzvah? How did the davening that we come to know today develop? So we're going to be doing that over the next few weeks. The first question we're going to be dealing with today is there an actual mitzvah d'oraisa? Is there a biblical mitzvah to daven? Now, at first glance, it might sound like a silly question, because in the last few weeks, we've been going through different reasons why we daven, and I would constantly bring different psukim that reference descriptions of davening. So you might say to me, well, what about all those psukim? What kind of question is this? So as we're going to see, just because something is referenced in the Torah, specifically when we're talking about things that are referenced in the stories of the Torah, does not mean that it is actual a biblical commandment. Sometimes you have things that are hinted to or referenced, and where we can learn something about the nature of davening from those hints, but that doesn't mean there was actually necessarily a commandment. And you'll understand better as we go through the sources today, because sometimes we have things that are written in the Torah or referred to in the Torah, but that doesn't mean that there's an actual commandment that we should be doing them. They might be what's called an asmachta. Asmachta in the world of halacha means it's hinted to, it's referred to in the text, but it might not be an actual commandment. One other question that might be coming to your minds is, who cares whether it's biblical or not? Everyone agrees there's a rabbinic commandment. Everyone agrees that there is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan to daven 2-3 times a day, as we'll get to. It started out as 2, maybe now it's 3. So why does it matter whether it's biblical or whether it's rabbinic? If we all know, and we're committed Orthodox Jews, we keep rabbinic Judaism just like we keep biblical Judaism. So the answer to that is, number one, sometimes there are practical differences, practically, between something that is biblical versus something that is rabbinic in terms of certain unique situations. There might be reasons where you could be lenient or act in a certain way, depending on whether a certain mitzvah is biblical or rabbinic. And number two, the actual conversation itself about the nature of the biblical mitzvah can actually shed light on the nature of davening and on our understanding of davening. And so we're not just doing this to understand the specifics, but to really be able to develop and continue to learn more about davening. So we're going to start by looking at the sources. The first place you look to know if something is biblical or not, if something is midoraisa, where do you start? Look at the Torah. Look at the Torah. Where are there references to davening in the Torah? And if there are, what are those references? And how might others who would say it's rabbinic, if there are those who say it's rabbinic, how would they understand their sources? Let's start with the psukim. Source number one is the well-known pasuk, which is the basis that most of us identify as the source for davening. It's a pasuk from Shema. V'haya im shamoa tishme'u el mitzvotai, and it will be if you will listen to my mitzvot, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom, that I command you to do today, le'ahava et Hashem Elokechem, to love Hashem, uli avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, and to serve Him with all of your heart and all of your soul. Now, the pasuk does not explicitly mention tefillah, does not specifically mention prayer, but the Midrash, the Sifri, in Sefer Devarim, quotes a debate as to what it means le'avdo, to serve Him. Serving is a very vague term. What does it mean to serve God? What is there a specific action or commandment that's associated with serving God? So the Sifri says in source number 2, it brings a few opinions. Uli avdo, one opinion is, what does it mean to serve God? Zet Talmud, it refers to the study of Talmud, to learning, to understanding, to developing your knowledge of Torah. That is the way that we serve God. If you continue to the next underlined part, davar acher, another opinion. Uli avdo, what does it mean to serve Hashem? Zut Second understanding is that the phrase uli avdo is a reference to tefillah, which would mean, seemingly, that would be an indication that there is a mitzvah d'oraisa, there's a biblical commandment to daven. Ata omer, says the Midrash, ata omer zu tefillah o'enu ela avoda. How do you know what means tefillah? Maybe it means something else. Maybe it just means to serve God in the general term. Talmud lomar, b'chol livavchem u'b'chol nafshechem. The pasuk says, uli avdo b'chol livavchem, to serve Him with your heart and with your soul. V'chiyesh avodah b'leiv. Normally we refer to actual work, avodah, it's not done in the heart. What is avodah b'leiv? What does it mean to serve with your heart? Talmud lomar, uli avdo zu tefillah. That's the indication that uli avdo is a reference to davening. Okay, so we have one pasuk. That pasuk is a little bit vague, and we have two opinions in the Medrash as to whether that pasuk is referring to tefillah or not. Okay, we see a similar thing happening in another pasuk. There's another pasuk that is quoted by some to be the source for davening, and this is a pasuk in Shemos. The pasuk says in source number 3, "Va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem." You should serve Hashem your God. Uveirach et lachmecha ve'et meimecha, and then He will bless your bread and your water. V'hasiroti mechala mikirbecha, and I will remove illness from amongst you. Okay, that if you do this avodah, then Hashem will repay you or will answer you in kind by taking care of you. And again, the question becomes, what does it mean, va'avadetem? What does it mean, and you should serve Him? So here too we have the Medrash, and the Medrash quotes two different opinions. One opinion in source number 4, va'avadetem eit Hashem Elokechem zu tefillah. One opinion is va'avadetem is referring to davening. V'chein hu omer, as it says earlier, uli avdo v'chol levavchem eze hi avodah shebalev havi omer zu tefillah, as we saw before, referencing the earlier pasuk. Davar acher, another opinion, va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem avdehu b'torato avdehu b'mikdasho. The other interpretation is, no, avodah here means keeping the Torah, or it's a reference to the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan. Okay, so what we've seen here so far are two psukim that may refer to tefillah, and according to one opinion, are a source for tefillah, and according to the second opinion, another opinion, they can be referencing something else. Now, why would we need two? Let's assume for a second, for argument's sake, that the pasuk is referring to tefillah. Why do you think we would have two psukim? What do you mean? Okay. Right, so there's a machlokas in the Gemara whether it's keneged, correct. Keneged, it's medium. That's true. That's the well-known Gemara. But why would that mean we need two different psukim? Because they're high. That's, I think, maybe what you're trying to say. Okay, so perhaps what you're suggesting. Good. So good. Okay, so I think what you're suggesting, and I'll just elaborate a little bit, is the simple understanding would be that if both of these psukim are referring to tefillah, they're referring to different aspects of tefillah, different things that are accomplished by tefillah. And in fact, if you look at the psukim themselves, they're very, very different psukim. One context is uli avdo b'chol levavchem u'v'chol nafshechem. It's a very general. You should serve Him with your heart and with your soul. That's one. What's the other model? You should serve Hashem, and what's going to happen if you serve Hashem? What's going to happen if you daven? You're going to get things. So the psukim are actually highlighting different aspects of what we have discussed in the last week of why we daven. One pasuk is highlighting we daven because if we daven, then God will give us bread. He'll give us water. He'll take care of us. Kind of like that quid pro quo that we've talked about. That's one aspect of davening. The other pasuk is saying, why should you daven? Because that's part of an overall avodah. It's part of how you should be relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which I would understand to mean some of the other reasons we talked about for why you daven. You don't just daven to get things from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You daven to connect with Him. You daven to remember, to remind yourself of all the important things of what's important to you. You daven because it's part of your avodah. So it could be that if we have two different psukim, it's because they're highlighting different aspects of what tefillah is supposed to be. Okay, so now that we've seen the psukim, the next step you go to, after seeing the psukim, in order to understand if something is biblical or not, now we need to go to the Gemara. Now we need to see is there evidence in the Gemara? How does the Gemara understand these psukim and analyze these psukim? And how do they interpret the question of davening? So there are a number of different Gemarot. Some Gemarot seem to indicate that davening is biblical, and there are some Gemarot that seem to indicate that davening is rabbinic. We'll go through them. Some of them are a little bit technical, so you'll forgive me, but they're basically just establishing that there's going to be really two different ways, two different opinions. Yes? What does it take to be a mitzvah? Excellent. Okay. Excellent question, and I appreciate the question. The question was, how do we know, or what establishes something as a mitzvah? Okay, so I would say the best way that I think explain it is this way. We know according to our Masorah that there are 613 mitzvot. Okay? Everyone agrees to that. The big question becomes, when it comes to what's considered a mitzvah, is what are those 613 mitzvot? And there are a number of great rabbis, Gedolim, Rishonim, Gaonim, and Rishonim, who took upon themselves to basically list the 613 mitzvot. most famously was the Rambam. The Rambam has in his Sefer HaMitzvot, we're going to get to him in a little bit, he has a Sefer HaMitzvot where he lists all 613 mitzvot. Many other people did the Sefer HaChinuch did the same thing. Rav Saadia Gaon did the same thing. Many people did the same thing. The big challenge becomes, they all agree that there's 613, but they argue about what those 613 are. And then it becomes a whole conversation. Why do you leave this one out, and why do you leave that out, and why do you include this one? And there's different rules, and it's interesting because the Rambam lists his, and then the Ramban, who we're going to talk about today, has a commentary on the Rambam where he argues and says, you left this out, and this shouldn't be there. And it becomes a debate. Now, what establishes something? It has to be biblical. Meaning, in order for you to say something is a mitzvah, is a biblical mitzvah, you need to bring a pasuk, you need to show that pasuk, you need to show the interpretation of that pasuk. And people might disagree, and that's okay. And that's part of the question becomes. Now, that's what we're going to see. Meaning today, we're going to see that there is a big debate amongst the Rishonim, a big machlokas Rishonim, how we should look at davening. Is davening, and the best way to phrase it is the following way. Is davening an obligation or is davening an opportunity? Is davening a biblical mitzvah, that this is what we should do? Or is davening not necessarily an obligation? You don't have to daven. Davening is an opportunity. It's God out of God's goodness, he gives us the opportunity to daven, but there's no straight up obligation. That's the framing that we're going to see today, the machlokas we're going to see today. But before we even get to the Rishonim, there are references to this question in the Gemara itself. There are a number of Gemaras that discuss tefillah, and they seem to hint to whether or not there's an obligation or it's not, or there's no obligation. Tzitzis is a little bit different. Tzitzis is a little bit different because tzitzit is a situational obligation. Meaning, if you happen to have a garment of 4 corners, then you have to make sure to put tzitzis on. What if you decide not to wear a garment of 4 corners? Everyone agrees there's no obligation to wear a garment of 4 corners. If I were to decide not to wear tzitzis today, that wouldn't be me doing it. It would be me missing out on the opportunity. But if I decided to wear a piece of clothing that had 4 corners, I would be obligated to put it on. It's a little bit of a different conversation. We're going to see there is a parallel to the conversation about davening that we're going to see soon. There are other mitzvot where this debate, obligation versus opportunity, but tzitzit is unique. I'll give another example comparing it to yours, mezuzah. If you have a house, you need to put a mezuzah on your house, okay? But it doesn't mean not everyone has a house. If you don't have a house, you don't need to put a mezuzah up. So those were situational mitzvot, but that's different than here. Here, the question is going to be, is there an obligation every single day to daven? Or there's no obligation to daven every single day? If I want to take advantage of the opportunity, that's God's chesed that he's given us. But that's a very different, it's a different conversation. Okay, so let's look at the Gemarot. We're going to look at the Gemaras that seem to indicate in either direction, and then from there we'll go into this debate between the Rambam and the Ramban, which we'll get to in a second. We're going to skip source number 4. Source number 5 is the well-known Gemara that the Medrash quoted, which is the Gemara quotes the pasuk of Uli Avdol B'chol Avchem and says, what does it refer to? It refers to tefillah. Simple understanding is, like the Medrash said, that the pasuk is referring to prayer. Look at the Gemara in source number 6. The Gemara in source number 6 is discussing the various obligations for different mitzvot. The Gemara says, Nashim ve'avadim uktanim, women, servants, and ktanim, people who are below the age of bar mitzvah, pturim mikriyat shma umin hatfilin v'chayavin b'tfilah u'v'mezuzah u'birkat hamazon. Okay, so an important distinction that I want to just clarify is the Gemara and many of the Rishonim will differentiate between what they call tfilah and what they call kriyat shma. Now that might be confusing for us because you think, wait a second, isn't shma part of our davening? So the answer is that many people understand there to be 2 separate mitzvot. There's the mitzvah to read Kriyat Shema. That's not a mitzvah of davening. That's actually a mitzvah that's associated with what's called Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, with accepting the yoke of heaven. Some associate that mitzvah with learning Torah. So there is an actual mitzvah, according to most Rishonim, called saying Kriyat Shema that is separate from the mitzvah to daven. The mitzvah to daven is usually a reference to saying Shmona Esrei, which we'll get to because that is the main. Okay, so when we're talking about Shema versus, there are some people who say that Shema is d'oraisa, is biblical, saying Shema is biblical, but davening Shemona Esrei is not. Some say both are biblical, some say both are rabbinic, but they're two distinct mitzvot, and that's where it might get a little bit confusing. 2 distinct mitzvot. So this Mishnah says women, servants, and ktanim are patur from Shema and from wearing tefillin, but they are obligated in what we call tefillah and mezuzah and birkat hamazon. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara then tries to understand why women are, how you understand their obligation. Says the Gemara, v'chayavin b'tfilah. Why are they obligated in tefillah? Why should women be obligated in tefillah? dirachme ninhu, because tefillah is an opportunity to ask for rachamim, to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to ask for mercy from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Meaning tefillah is not just a standard obligation. It's about developing a relationship and talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that women should be involved in. Women have the obligation. Continues the Gemara. Why would I have thought otherwise? Why should women not be? Mahu detema. I might have thought, Hoil viktivba erev voker b'tzaharaim. Since regarding tefillah, the pasuk mentions morning, evening, morning, and afternoon, meaning there's a time to daven. And if there's a time to daven, we know that there's a well-known rule, halacha, that women are generally patur, exempt from time-bound mitzvot aseh. Women are patur from mitzvot aseh shazman grama. Any mitzvot aseh which is time-bound, women are generally patur from. So says the Gemara, you might have thought they should be patur from davening because it's a mitzvot aseh shazman grama. It's a time-bound positive commandment. But then comes the Gemara to say, but because davening is different, rachmin inhu, it's about asking for mercy from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, therefore it's a rule breaker. Women are obligated even though it's a mitzvah aseh shazman grama. Now, without getting into all the details of women's obligation, maybe we'll get to that in a future shiur. It's a fascinating conversation about women and their obligation to daven, and why most poskim believe that women are obligated to daven, and how many times we can get to that conversation later. But what's clear from this Gemara is that, or what the Gemara seems to be saying, is that it calls it a mitzvah aseh shehazman grama, a positive commandment that is time bound. By definition, a positive commandment means a biblical commandment, which means this Gemara seems to be clearly stating that this is a biblical mitzvah, that the mitzvah in the Torah, that the mitzvah of davening is a biblical commandment. And even though it's a biblical commandment that's time-bound, women are still obligated. So the evidence from this Gemara seems to indicate there is a mitzvah, a biblical commandment to daven. Let's go to the next Gemara. The next Gemara also quotes a pasuk and seems to learn tefillah from it. The pasuk says, the pasuk we saw before, "Ve'avadetem et Hashem Elokeichem uveirach et lachmecha ve'et meimecha." You should serve Hashem, and He will bless your bread and your mayim. "Ve'avadetem et Hashem Elokeichem." You should serve Hashem. Zu kriyat shema v'tefillah. This is a reference to both the mitzvah of kriyat shema and the mitzvah of tefillah, which means, again, this pasuk is referring to tefillah. And what does it mean? Uveirach et lachmecha ve'et meimecha, and He'll bless your bread and your water. Zu pat b'melach v'kiton shel mayim, that He'll give you some water, some bread, and He'll give you some water. So again, the simple understanding of this Gemara is that clearly there is a commandment to daven. The Torah says va'avadetem, and that's reference to davening. The problem is, if you look at a couple of other Gemaras, the Gemara seems to explicitly say that there is no biblical commandment to daven. That davening is d'Rabbanan. Look at source number 8. Source number 8, just to give you a little bit of background, it's a bit of a technical halachic discussion, but it's just to highlight the point. The Mishnah is discussing what should a person do, or the Gemara says, let's say a man is in the middle of doing certain acts, of certain mitzvot, and then he realizes that he had a seminal emission, in which case he is impure, and he did not yet purify himself. Should he continue in the act of what he's doing? So what happens to a person in the middle of davening, and then they realize that they had a seminal emission, they didn't purify themselves yet? Or what if they're in the middle of kriyat shema? Or what if they're in the middle of benching? What should you do? And the Gemara seems to point out that there seems to be a contradiction between different actions. Utznan, the Mishnah in source number 8. The Mishnah or the Breita says, Haya omed bitfila. If a person is in the middle of davening, he's in the middle of saying Shemona Esrei, v'nizkar shehu bal keri, and he realized that he had a seminal emission and that he had not yet purified himself. He had not yet been right b'tahar at tatzmo. What should he do? Says the Gemara, lo yafsik, don't stop in the middle, ela yikatzer, finish up the Shemona Esrei, but shorten it. Now, they don't discuss what that means exactly, what you should skip, but the point is, it doesn't tell you to stop in the middle. It says you should shorten it. Continues the Gemara, ta'ama de'itchil. That implies that the only reason he's allowed to finish it is because he started it already. Halo itchil, lo yatchil. That implies that had he not yet started davening, had he remembered that he was a Balkari before he started davening, he shouldn't start. The implication is he shouldn't even start if he hadn't yet davened. And it says the Gemara, but wait a second, that's different than what we had seen earlier. We had seen earlier in other mitzvot that you shouldn't even start if you realize that you're a Balkari. So the Gemara goes back and forth and back and forth. The final line is the underlined part of the Gemara, where the Gemara says, Ella kriyat shma ubirakat hamazon deoraita utfila derabanan. The rules are going to be different by kriyat shma and by birkat hamazon because those are biblical commandments. Kriyat shma, it says that in Shema you should say these words. And there's a pasuk that tells us that the person should bench after they daven. So because it's biblical, it's going to have one rule regarding a balkari, and tefillah is going to have a different rule. Why? Because tefillah is derabanan. Explicitly, the Gemara seems to point out that tefillah is rabbinic in nature. Okay. One more source before, just to get through this technical, is another conversation. The conversation in source number 9 as a background is talking about somebody who forgot to do the mitzvah of lulav, of dalad minim on Sukkot. A person forgot to shake the lulav on Sukkot. It's towards the end of the day, and he realized he hadn't shaken the lulav. He's in the middle of eating his meal. He's in the middle of eating a nice afternoon meal, and he realizes that, oh my God, I forgot to shake the lulav. What do I do? So says the Gemara, Amart notlo al shulchano, that he should take the lulav and he should shake right away. Limneimra demafsik. That means that you should imply that if I'm in the middle of a meal and I realize I didn't do it, I should stop my meal. I should interrupt the meal, get up and shake the lulav. Says the Gemara, but wait a second. We have a similar conversation with somebody who hasn't yet davened. Let's say a person is in the middle of his meal and he realizes he didn't yet daven mincha. Okay, and he's in the middle of lunch. Does he stop his meal to daven mincha or not? There's a whole conversation back and forth. And the Gemara says here it says you shouldn't. So why by lulav and esrog do I interrupt my meal in order to do the mitzvah immediately? And yet by davening, I'm told I can keep finishing my meal, and I don't have to stop the meal to daven. So the Gemara gives a few different answers, but one answer, which is at the very end, the Gemara says, Dilma ha deoraita, the last few lines of the source, ha derabanan. Maybe it's because there's a fundamental difference between the mitzvah of dalad minim and the mitzvah of davening. Dalad minim is deoraita. Everyone agrees taking dalad minim is biblical in nature. And therefore, maybe I have to stop my meal because I'm dealing with a mitzvah deoraita. When you're dealing with a mitzvah deoraita, you stop your meal, you shake the lulav, and then you can finish your meal. But davening is derabanan. And if davening is only derabanan, maybe you shouldn't interrupt your meal. You can finish your meal, and then you can do it. Or if you're not going to have time, okay. But you don't have to interrupt your meal. So again, without getting into, I apologize if you got a little bit lost on some of the technical points, but what we've seen here is that we have some Gemaras that seem to indicate that that it is a biblical commandment, and yet we have some sources that seem to indicate that it's rabbinic in nature. I'm sorry. So again, I don't want to get into the details, but the answer is that one person gave a different answer, and someone said to him, "Why are you giving that answer? You can just give this answer." Dilma doesn't necessarily. Again, it could mean that he's not sure, or Dilma could mean here that maybe the reason is. That's the interpretation. I didn't look at Rishonim enough to tell you to understand it 100%, but it's clear that someone is basically saying the person who's asking this question at the end is basically, what's the question? Why are you even asking the question? Maybe it seems like he's saying maybe it's because this is Dorais and this is Rabbanan. Correct. It's a very good point. I just don't want to get into that detail. Yes. Yes. When we talk about mitzvot aseh or mitzvot lo ta'aseh, positive commandments and negative commandments, usually we're referring to the biblical commandments. Of course, there are many rabbinic commandments, and rabbinic commandments are also divided by mitzvot aseh and lo ta'aseh. But when we use the phrase aseh in the Gemara they're referring to the biblical commandment, because the phrase aseh implies. If you look, by the way, we talked about how there are the monei hamitzvot, people who count the mitzvot, right? The Rambam has his sefer mitzvot. He divides his sefer mitzvot into two sections: the mitzvot aseh, the positive commandments, and the negative commandments. So generally, when we're talking about a conversation where Rishonim or Gemara will say mitzvot aseh or mitzvot lo ta'aseh, that it means they're referring to the biblical commandment. Even though, of course, rabbinic commandments also have ones that are aseh and lo ta'aseh. But the phrase is kind of like a keyword for the biblical commandment that are negative or positive. Okay. So now let's look at this fascinating machlokes. Yes, sorry. No, I believe they are. Let's read it again. They said they're patur from Kriyat Shema and from Tefillin, but they're obligated in Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Birkat HaMazon. Okay? And again, even Kriyat Shema, it's a whole conversation. Why not? I didn't bring that Gemara, but that's a whole separate discussion. But yes, they are obligated in Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Birkat HaMazon. Okay. Okay, so this is a what's known as a well-known machlokas, a famous machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban. As I mentioned, the Rambam did a number of wonderful things. But one of the very ambitious things the Rambam did was he put together what he calls the Sefer HaMitzvos. And in the Sefer HaMitzvos, he delineates what he believes to be the 613 mitzvos. He has the mitzvot aseh, the positive commandments, and then he has the mitzvot lo ta'aseh. And not only does he list them, but he describes them in relative detail. And what happened was you have the Ramban. The Ramban got a copy of the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, and he has what's called the Hasagot. He has his reactions, and his reactions are two types. Sometimes he'll agree with the Rambam, and sometimes he'll disagree with the Rambam. Now, disagreeing can mean two things. It's if you disagree with the Rambam and you say this isn't a mitzvah, what does that also mean? You got to replace that mitzvah with something else. Now, again, it's not out of necessity. It's the Ramban will argue if he thinks something is not a mitzvah, and then he'll write, and he writes a whole commentary. Very often, if you ever purchase or you've seen a text of the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, on the side is the commentary of the Ramban, Nachmanides, where he writes his reactions. And then you have people, who we're going to see some of them soon, who then wrote a commentary to the Ramban defending the Rambam. So you have a lot of beautiful conversation taking place because the Rambam himself, he never saw the Ramban, so he can't respond himself. So you have all these different interpretations. One's called the Megillas Esther, one is called, there's different ones, Kinas Sofrim, that basically come and defend the Rambam. And it's a beautiful conversation in terms of understanding. And there were many other people who were Monei Mitzvot, who counted the Mitzvot. The Rambam is probably the most famous. Yes.
Any of us going to remember all the reasons. So the basic issue to me is, if you accept the idea that davening is required, then what do I get out of it? What do I get out of it? Why am I doing it? Not why there's 6 different opinions. But what am I getting out of it?
Well, I think that's two separate questions. Meaning, I think that's a very important question, but I think it's also a secondary question, meaning sometimes we do things because we're commanded to. If there's a mitzvah, I would say it's a dual question. The question he asked was, well, then it's not just a question of is there a commandment. The question then is, what do I get out of it? And I think it's an important question. I think we spent a lot of time on that when we talked about why we daven. But I also think that the question of is something a mitzvah is a dual question, because sometimes we need to know what a mitzvah is because we need to know what we're commanded to do, and as I don't know if I think we've discussed in different contexts before, sometimes we do mitzvot even if we don't understand why, or if I don't connect to it. We do it because we're commanded. That's part of being commanded and having someone who commands us. Nevertheless, we all believe, and that's why we spend so much time on it, we also believe that it'll be more meaningful if we find meaning in it and work and strive to find meaning, which is why we spend so much time on trying to understand it. So I think both are important. I think it's important to know what is the biblical mitzvah. And you're going to see soon that when we get to it, it's not just about is it a mitzvah or not. The way the Rambam describes the mitzvah is very, very important. And the Ramban's understanding of the mitzvah is very important too. And as we're going to see, it could be that both aspects are true. It could be that it's an obligation and an opportunity. Right? It doesn't have to be either or. And that's part of what we're going to see now. Look at the Rambam in source number 10. The Rambam in source number 10, this is the 5th mitzvah that the Rambam brings, which means for him, this is a priority. Don't forget, the Rambam lists 613 mitzvah, and he can list them in any order he wants. And the first one he has, what's the first mitzvah the Rambam has? Belief in God. Okay, meaning the Rambam, when he's listing these mitzvot, he's not listing them in the order of the Torah. Okay, someone who did that, for example, is the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch has his list of 613 mitzvot, and he lists them by parsha, the way they came up in the Torah. The Rambam doesn't do that. The Rambam can write them in any order he wants, which means that he seemingly is going to put them in an order of what he thinks to be fundamental and important. Okay, and listen to the way the Rambam writes it. I mean fundamental. I meant fundamental is, I guess, the best way to say it. Meaning, you're right. Importance, they're all important, and the Mishnah in Avos says we shouldn't necessarily say one is more important than the other. I agree with you. I mikabel. I mean that there are certain ones that we would probably argue are more fundamental to our service to God, and the fact that the Rambam puts this here in one of the 5 probably means it's there. But look at the way he describes it, because he doesn't just open up by saying the 5th mitzvah is to daven. Look how he does it. Veha mitzvah hachamishit. We're in source number 10. Excuse me. The 5th mitzvah, he shetzivanu le'avdo yitaleh. We are commanded to serve Hashem. Ukvar nichpal tzivoizeh pa'amayim. And this mitzvah is mentioned more than one. Pa'amim, it's not even pa'amayim. It's mentioned a number of times. Amar ve'avadetem et Hashem elokechem, the pasuk that we quoted, that you should serve Hashem. Ve'oto ta'avodu, which is another pasuk, and him you should serve. Ve'oto ta'avod. uli avdo. So the Rambam lists at least 4 different places where the commandment is to serve Hashem. So mitzvah number 5 is serve Hashem. The afal pi, and even though shezeh hatzivoy hu gam kein min hatzivuyim hakolelim, kimo shebi'arnu b'shoresh haravi'i, even though this mitzvah is one of those commandments that has many aspects to it, because again, the phrase serve Hashem is a very vague phrase. We have to define what it means. So says the Rambam, even though it's called serve Hashem, and serving Hashem can include many aspects, hine yesh bo yichud. There is one main expression of this mitzvah, shehu tziva b'tfilah, and that is the commandment to daven. Okay, so what the Rambam did here was not by accident, was by design. He doesn't just say the 5th mitzvah is to daven. He puts the mitzvah of davening in a context. In what kind of context? Avoda, service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Davening is just one aspect of our major, what we call serving Hashem. It's just, the Rambam says, that's the main expression of that serving of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, V'lashon HaSifri, and he quotes the Sifri, Zu Tefillah, that Ulavdo means Tefillah, and then again he goes on to just discuss some of the sources. Okay, so according to the Rambam, we have this biblical mitzvah. It's to daven, and it's within the context of serving Hashem. The Rambam writes about this mitzvah elsewhere as well, because the Rambam has another besides the Sefer HaMitzvos, he has many other works, but one of his other most important works for us halachically is the Mishnah Torah. In the Mishnah Torah, otherwise known as the Yad Chazakah, he discusses all the different commandments and the psukim from the Gemara. So if you look at source number 11, we have to also see how does the Rambam phrase davening in the Mishnah Torah. And he has a whole section called Hilchot Tefillah. Look at source number 11, Halacha Aleph. Mitzvat aseh lehitpalel b'kol yom. It is the positive commandment to daven every single day. Shene'emar ve'avaditem et Hashem Elokeichem, as the pasuk says, you should serve Hashem your God. Mipi hashmua lamdu she'avodah zu hi tefillah. We've learned that this avodah is a reference to tefillah. Shene'emar uli avdo b'chol livavchem. Right? The pasuk says you should serve Hashem. What does serving mean? So because we have another pasuk which says uli avdo b'chol livavchem, ezuhu avodah shebelev, it means amru chachamim ezuhu avodah shebelev zu tefillah. Okay, so the Rambam says very clearly there is a mitzvah d'oraisa to daven every day. Then he adds something very important. Ve'ein minyan hatfilot min Torah. How many times you daven a day? That's not mandated by the Torah. Ve'ein mishnah hatfilah zot min Torah. Repeating it or the text or any of those other aspects of it are not midoraisa. Ve'ein litfilah zman kavua min Torah. There's no set time that you have to daven according to the Torah. The Rambam's understanding, and we're going to see next week that not everyone agrees to this, but according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is daven once a day, whenever you want. And as we're going to see in a second, you can say whatever you want. Continues the Rambam in Halacha Bet, Ulefikach, Nashim va'avadim, chayavim b'tfilah. And therefore, women and avadim are actually obligated in tefillah. Why? Lefi shehi mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama. By the way, the Rambam has an interesting, and by the way, if you're thinking about the Gemara that we saw earlier, the Rambam has a different interpretation of the Gemara we saw earlier. Says the Rambam, because there's no specific time to daven, it is actually not a time-bound positive commandment. It is actually mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama, because there's no defined time. You can daven whenever you want. And that's the opinion. The Rambam explains that whole Gemara that we saw earlier in a totally different way. And therefore, says the Rambam, it's a positive commandment, and women are obligated just like everybody else because it's not time-bound. Ela chiyuv mitzvah zu kachi. He says, this is the mitzvah. What is the mitzvah? Sheyehei adam mitchanen umitpalel b'kol yom. A person should praise and daven to Hashem. Umagid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Or mitchanen really means to plea, And he should say God's praises. V'achar kach shoel tzrachav. And then he can ask for his needs. Shehu tzarich lahem. Sorry? Yeah, very good. Correct. We'll get that in a second. First, you praise Hashem. Then you should ask for the things that you want. And then afterwards, you thank Hashem. And as you pointed out correctly, that's actually what we do in the Shemona Esrei and the Amidah. We start with praise. We then go to Bakasha, and then we go to Hodaya. And that's what the Rambam has outlined here. Now, again, he doesn't tell you what to say. Biblically, he's just suggesting this is the way it should look. But technically he's just saying what it should look. But biblically, there's no mandate. 1 second, I'll get to the question in 1 minute. Halacha Gimel, and this is just again defining what the tefillah should look like. Im haya ragil marbe b'tachana. If you wanted to do it and you like it, You would say a lot. You would daven a lot. V'imaya arel svatayim. If you're somebody who's not very good with words, midaber kifi yicholto v'chol eish yirtzeh. You should say whatever you want when you want. This is the Rambam's definition of davening biblically. V'chein minyan atfilah kol echad yafi yicholto. How many times you should daven according to your abilities. Yesh mitpalel pam achat b'yom. Some people would daven once a day. V'yesh mitpalelim pamim harben. Some daven more than once a day, many times. V'hakol yun mitpalelim nochach hamikdash b'kom b'kom sheyah. The key is that when you should daven facing the Beit Hamikdash. V'chen hayad davar tamid mi Moshe Rabbeinu ad Ezra. And says the Rambam, this is what davening was from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu till Ezra. One time, and there was a biblical commandment to daven one time a day, when you wanted, what you wanted, however you wanted. Yes. So that's, you're asking a great question whether there's a whole discussion regarding the obligation for women and what they need to daven and what's included and what's not. I don't want to get into that now, but hopefully we can try to cover that in the future shiur. But this is all midoraita. Okay, now, yes, please.
Does he ever explain why he only says once a day? Why not more times? Even if it's
Excellent question. Next week we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about the meaning. We're going to get to if you believe it's doraisa, how many times is it? There's a machloket, whether it's once a day. He doesn't say why but there are some of the commentaries on the Rambam, so you make suggestions as to where the Rambam got that from. And not everyone agrees to it. So we'll get to that next week, Be'ezrat Hashem. Some understandings as to where the Rambam got once a day from. Some suggestions connected to the pasuk. We'll get to that. Okay, so that's the Rambam.
But there's certain mitzvot that it doesn't say that mitzvot are important. So how come it's not clear in the Torah which mitzvot are good,
It's a very good question. I mean, there's a lot of things in the Torah that are not very clear. And I think that has to do with a different question, which is the question of why is the Torah written in the way that it is? It's written shorthand. It needs a key, right? You have the written law and you have the oral law, and they need each other to complete each other. Why is the Torah not written? Why do you need an oral law? Why not just write everything in the Torah? Why is not clearer? I think is what you're.
Mitzvot are the basis of our lives. Why isn't it more barur?
It's a good question. You could suggest. I mean, there were some who may suggest that it was clear, and then over time it became unclear. Some who say maybe God made it unclear on purpose so that we could require the rabbis to interpret it. And once you get to the rabbis, then it becomes subject to machlokas. There's different ways to look at it, but it's more of a larger question. And I can't say that I have a straight answer. But it's a good question. There are many things that are very unclear, and they would be much easier if they were clearer. And you could say that's just that it was clearer originally, and it just became unclear because we lost certain mesoras over time. Or it could be that was the way Kadosh Baruch Hu intended it, and that's the whole development of the oral law and the development of machlokas and the development of the way Torah as we have it today. Just because of time, I want to.
So you have to, now in conservative quote unquote religion, so that goes away from. In other words, there was a possibility that conservative Judaism in America became a very major
denomination. Okay.
So it's not doing exactly what.
No, what I'm not sure what you mean.
How's that connected to Rambam and the Ramban? How would they relate to these changes? How do they relate to women?
That's a totally separate conversation. I don't want. What about? No, I understand, but I'm not sure that I don't want to get off topic. I think it's an independent question. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but I definitely think it's taking us a little bit off topic. And just because of time, I'm going to beg to keep going. Okay. So now that's the Rambam's understanding. Now we have the Ramban. The Ramban saw this Rambam, and he clearly disagrees. Okay. By the way, just to give you another example, there's another famous machloket. Well, it's a well-known, it seems to be a machlokes for the Rambam and the Ramban, just relatively well-known, regarding the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. Some of you may be familiar with that. The Rambam leaves out any clear indication, at least. Some say that there are indications in the Rambam that there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. The Ramban takes it as this, you left it out. Okay, so there are many examples of this. One of the most famous ones is this issue of davening. Look at the Ramban. We're not going to read the whole Ramban, but the Ramban in source number 12 starts by saying Ve'ein haskama bazeh. He says, I can't agree with this. Shekvar be'aru hachachamim b'gemara tefillah derabanan. Because there are a number of Gemaras where the Gemara says explicitly davening is derabanan, tefillah is derabanan. So how could the Rambam disagree? How could the Rambam argue on those Gemaras? And then he goes on right now to explain all of those Gemaras and list those Gemaras. We're not going to get into all the details. The question then is, so how does the Rambam envision tefillah? Look at the middle, the next underlined part of the Rambam. Says the Rambam, Vadai kol inyan hatefillah ena chova klal. The whole idea of prayer is it's not an obligation. Avalhu mimidot hachesed haborei yisparach aleinu sheshomea ve'oneh v'chol kareinu elav. Rather, this is a chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he gives us the privilege and the opportunity to come to him and to pray to him, and that he will respond. So in short, according to the Ramban, prayer is not an obligation, it is a privilege and an opportunity. That is the opinion of the Ramban, which means that, should you still do it? We're going to see soon. You should still do it. Am I obligated to do it? No. And then the Ramban has one final addition, which he references. Again, we're going to skip all the details of this just because of time. The Ramban says the Ramban says, you know what, I'll throw you a bone. If there is a mitzvah to daven, says the Ramban, it's very, very limited in nature. The last underlined part of the Ramban, of the same source 12, the last underlined part. Ve'im ulai yeh midrasham b'tfilah ikar. If maybe ikar min HaTorah, there is some real context to the fact that there is something called a mitzvah d'oraisa to daven, nimna oto b'minyano shel harav, as the way that it is counted in the Rambam, v'nomar shehi mitzvah le'et hatzarot. The only time, says the Rambam, that I might agree that there's a mitzvah to daven is during times of crisis. During times of crisis, then there is a mitzvah to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Shena'amin shehu yitbarach v'yitaleh shomea tefillah v'hu hamatzil min hatzarot b'tefillah v'za'aka. Because we need to be able to know when we're in times of crisis, there's only one being we should be turning to, and who is that? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So during times of crisis, says the Ramban, I'll give you, there might be a mitzvah min HaTorah to daven during times of crisis. That there might be a mitzvah to do, but on a regular day-to-day basis, says the Ramban, there is no commandment, there is no obligation, there is only opportunity. Now the question becomes, okay, so one second, before we even try to understand this, okay, now, again, what we're not going to do today is go back to all the Gemaras and try to understand how the Rambam and the Ramban each read the Gemaras. Because they both have to do it, right? Because we saw two Gemaras that seemed to indicate it was a mitzvah, and two Gemaras. So how would they each explain their Gemaras? We could go back and, if we were in yeshiva, we'd go back and do a pill pull on how each one explains the Gemara. Trust me, they all do, and they all go back to the evidence and have different ways of explaining it. For time's sake, we're not going to do that. But they do go back and they discuss it. But what I wanted to understand is, okay, well, wait a second. According to the Rambam, does he also have this idea of davening during Eis Tzara? Meaning the Ramban's reference that there is a mitzvah that we should turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu during times of crisis, that's when a person should be turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and davening. How does the Rambam view that? Is that included in his initial? So in fact, if you look at the Rambam in another place, he understands that mitzvah differently. Okay? Because the Torah, we'll see it in a second. Look at source number 13. Source number 13. The Gemara said, the Rambam says the following, Halacha Aleph, Mitzvah hasei min HaTorah, liz'ok uleharia b'chatzotzrot al kol tzara shedavo al hatzibor. There is a mitzvah min HaTorah to shout or to make noise and to make b'chatzotzrot, use the trumpets on any tzara, any tragedy that falls upon the tzibor. Because the Torah says, shene'emar al hatzar hatzorer etchem v'harei otam b'chatzotzrot. That if any enemies come to you, you should make noise with the chatzotzrot. Kilomar, kol davar sheyatzar lachem, anything which causes you pain. Kigon batzoret, like if you have a famine, v'dever, v'arba, or you have a plague, or anything that's happening. Za'aku alein v'hariyu. You should make noise and you should shout using the trumpets. So the Rambam does agree that during times of crisis we're meant to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if you look carefully at the way the Rambam describes it, it's very different than what the Ramban said. The Ramban said that when we're in times of crisis, we're supposed to turn to Hashem and daven. What does the Rambam say we're supposed to do? Make noise with what? B'chatzotzrot. It's a totally different type of obligation. The Rambam says, yes, we're supposed to, as a community, get up and make noise, but it's not a reference to tefillah. It's not a reference to personal tefillah per se. It might include aspects of that, but it's a very, very different obligation. So the Rambam and the Ramban, seem to understand tefillah totally separately, and they also seem to understand the obligation. Please, if you don't have to stand, you're welcome to come in. You're welcome to come sit here. Okay. I don't like people standing. I feel bad. Okay. So, let's take a step back. According to the Rambam and according to the Ramban, they have very different understandings of tefillah. How would you understand the tefillah according to the Rambam? What is tefillah according to the Rambam? It's part of our what? Part of our avodat Hashem. It's part of our avodat Hashem. It's a part of what we're supposed to do on a daily basis. It's part of how we serve Hashem. It's part of what we need in order to go about our lives as Ovdei Hashem. According to the Ramban, who may agrees that there's tefillah only in times of need, what will be the purpose to tefillah? What's the goal of tefillah according to the Ramban? Ramban agrees, it seems at the end that there is tefillah, requesting things. It seems that we could suggest that the Rambam, at first glance, the Rambam and the Ramban have different visions of what tefillah is. According to the Rambam, tefillah is an obligation. It's part of your avodat Hashem. According to the Ramban, tefillah is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for when you want it. You want to ask him for something. You want to connect to him in some way. You can do it. And only in times of crisis is there a special obligation for you to turn to him and remember that he's the one that you're supposed to turn to. But it seems like a very different type of obligation in terms of its nature. However, if you turn to source, we're going to skip up a number of these sources. These are just sources where people try to defend each side. We're going to skip now to source number 17. Rav Soloveitchik has a beautiful explanation where he tries to reconcile the Rambam and the Ramban. And he tries to suggest that they're much more similar than we thought they were. That really both the Rambam and the Ramban are about davening during times of crisis. There's just two different types of crisis. There's communal crisis and there's personal crisis. I'm going to read the Rav's words because he really says it perfectly. Source number 17. The views of Maimonides and Nachmanides can be reconciled. Both regarded prayer as meaningful only if it is derived from a sense of tzara. They differ in their understanding of the word. Maimonides regarded daily life itself as being existentially in straits, inducing in the sensitive person feelings of despair, a brooding sense of life's meaninglessness, absurdity, lack of fulfillment. It is a persistent tzara, which exists bechol yom, daily. The word tzara connotes more than external trouble. It suggests an emotional and intellectual condition in which man sees himself as hopelessly trapped in a vast, impersonal universe, desolate without hope. Certainly, the psalmist's cry, min hametzar karati ka, out of my straits I have called upon the Lord, refers to an inner, rather than an externally induced state of constriction and depression. Out of this sense of discomfiture, prayer emerges. Offered in comfort and security, prayer is a paradox, modern methods of suburban worship and plush synagogues notwithstanding. The desire for proximity of wife and children at services comes from a need for comfort and security and comfort. Real prayer is derived from loneliness, helplessness, and a sense of dependence. Thus, while Nachmanides, the Ramban, dealt only with the surface crisis, public distress, tzarot tzibur, Maimonides regarded all life as a depth crisis, a tzarat yachid. The Torah bids man to actively combat and possibly eliminate superficial external crises. The ills of poverty, disease, and war are debilitating and impair our spiritual freedom. The Torah, however, encourages man to submit to and embrace the experience of the depth crisis. Thereby does man truly grasp the reality of his condition and become stirred to great heights of the spirit. For this depth crisis, there is no solution except prayer. Surface crisis can be overcome. The existential crisis can only be met by prayer. So what the Rav is beautifully pointing out is that there's two different types of tzara. There's the communal tzara, that's the Ramban's vision of tefillah. And then there's the personal tzara, the existential tzara that a person has on a daily basis. And that, says the Rav, that's the root of the commandment of how the Rambam understands things. The Rambam understands that there is tzara we have every single day. And that's where tefillah comes. And then, by the way, those who are familiar with the Rav's writing, this is very, very common. The Rav writing used to write a lot about existentialism and the lone. Right, one of the most famous works of Soloveitchik was The Lonely Man of Faith. Right, and many believe that he was the lonely man of faith in terms of feeling helplessness in an existential crisis. This is the Rav highlighting something very, very important. I will add that I believe that isn't necessarily pshat in the Rambam. Because the Rambam, in my opinion, seemed to be looking at it not just from coming out of a sense of pain, but from coming out of a sense of avoda, of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the Rav, I think, is a beautiful piece, and I think it adds a new dimension to the Rambam. Just because of time, I just want to finish. I'm sorry, just because there's one other source that I want to get to. One other source that I want to get to that I think will kind of bring this home. If you turn to source number 19 of Aaron Lichtenstein, there's one other mitzvah where there's a big debate. There's many, but one other important mitzvah, there's a big debate whether it's an opportunity or an obligation, and that is the mitzvah of tshuva. There was a debate amongst the Rishonim. Is there a mitzvah to do tshuva? Is tshuva a commandment that I have to do tshuva? Or is tshuva just an opportunity? It's not that you have to do tshuva, it's that if you want to do tshuva, God allows you to do tshuva. That's a big debate in the Rishonim. Rav Lichtenstein, in a piece he has on a number of essays on tshuva, tries to connect the two and point out that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And he writes it about tshuva, but I believe all the words he says here are true about tefillah as well. And I want to just read it with you, because I think he highlights that perhaps the way he says it is that tshuva is an opportunity that creates an obligation. Once you have the opportunity, if you're somebody who's spiritually sensitive, you're going to view it as an obligation. Because if you see what the opportunity is, you truly understand what the opportunity is, it's no longer just going to remain an option. If you're really somebody who takes it seriously, it's going to become an obligation. The way he says it is that opportunity engenders obligation. And I believe that same perspective could be true for tefillah as well. So just bear with me, we'll be done in 2 minutes. How do we categorize and describe tshuva? And again, I think we could really just put in tefillah for this. As an opportunity or as an obligation? The terms, of course, are quite different. When we speak of opportunity, we generally have in mind some fortunate, some undeserved option to which we are glad to have access. Whereas obligation conjured up a sense of pressing demand, a categorical imperative grounded in an existential situation, or mandated by an authoritative commander. One doesn't need to think hard to realize that the answer is that tshuva is both. I would like to examine in what sense it is both and how these aspects of tshuva are related. In effect, the Rambam has linked the two elements, again, we're skipping parts of it, the two elements we are addressing. If you have the opportunity, you must avail yourself of it. So apart from the fact that there might be a mitzvah of tshuva, just as there is a mitzvah of lulav, sukkah, or shofar, there is an additional ground for tshuva being obligatory. The fact that it is possible renders it mandatory. The opportunity produces the obligation. In effect, Rabbeinu Yonah and the Medrash are saying that the moment the opportunity is there, it engenders obligation, at least to a person who is morally and religiously sensitive. Failure to avail ourselves of the opportunity becomes a sin all over again. So if we ask ourselves whether tshuva is an opportunity, a chesed granted by God, or an obligation, a demand imposed upon us, the answer is that not only that it is both independently, it is both intertwined. The very existence of the opportunity imposes a fresh obligation. This is the meaning of the Rambam expression accordingly. It's a diuk in the Rambam there. It is inconceivable that a person who attaches significance to his own spiritual state should be totally impervious and insensitive to the ability to restore his relationship with God and to cleanse himself. If indeed he does not seize the opportunity, this is both a symptom and a cause for spiritual weakness. The sense that opportunity engenders obligation in the spiritual realm is not just a universal religious concept, but a central category of a Torah-based worldview. The failure to exploit spiritual potential, the failure to drink spiritual life to the lees, is not just some kind of pallid passivity, but in the perception of Chazal, it is spiritual rot, described as such and condemned as such. We are expected to live a life charged with a sense of obligation on the one hand, and with a sense of the awareness of the opportunity on the other. We need to keep our eyes and ears open to know where opportunity is present, and to live a life suffused with the interaction of the two. So we've seen, I'm not going to take questions because I want to end, but I'm happy to stay and answer anything personally one-on-one. Just, we discussed the question of whether or not there is a mitzvah to daven, a biblical command. We saw the psukim and we saw the gemaras that seem to point in different directions. We saw the machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam says there is a biblical obligation to daven every single day. The Ramban disagrees and understands it to be an opportunity on a daily basis and only a mitzvah perhaps during times of crisis. And we saw the Rav Soloveitchik, we suggested that seems to point to two different visions of what tefillah is. Rav Soloveitchik tried to put the two of them closer together, that both Rambam and the Ramban are about tefillah coming from a sense of crisis. For the Ramban that was external crisis, communal crisis, and for the Rambam that was more personal, existential crisis. And then we saw at the very end the beautiful words of Lichtenstein. He's talking about tshuva, but I think it applies to tefillah as well. That the answer is probably that they are both. That it can be an obligation according to the Rambam, but it is also an opportunity. And the fact that it's an opportunity brings it back to being an obligation. Because if something is an opportunity to those of us who are spiritually aware and spiritually careful, then we want to take advantage of that opportunity, and that would engender the obligation. Thank you, everybody. Wishing you a wonderful week.